In 2017, historians, literary scholars, computer scientists, digital humanities specialists, librarians, and commercial publishers came together to form the Oceanic Exchanges Project, funded by the Transatlantic Partnership for Social Sciences and Humanities 2016 Digging into Data Challenge. Researchers and contributors to the project came from the University of Stuttgart, the Berlin State Library, Europeana, the National Autonomous University of Mexico, Utrecht University, the Dutch National Library, the University of Turku, the National Library of Finland, Loughborough University, University College London, University of Edinburgh, the British Library, Gale, a Cengage company, Northeastern University, University of Nebraska-Lincoln, North Carolina State University, the National Library of Australia, and the National Library of New Zealand. The project had a relatively flat structure with two overlapping team frameworks, national teams and work package teams. The national teams worked primarily as practical units and as liaisons to the relevant national libraries or working through language-specific material. The work package teams were comprised of individuals across all 6 nations and disciplines and met virtually via Skype, with some face-to-face meetings at convenient workshops or conferences. There were 6 work packages, with the primary research for the project falling in 3 main aims. One was to develop methodologies and provide examples of best practice in tracing the movement, that is, reprinting of newspaper texts across linguistic and political borders. Most of the team had already undertaken significant research in so-called scissors and paste journalism within their national or linguistic borders. Oceanic exchanges offer the opportunity to see not only the extent to which news traveled between these cultural silos, the extent to which news really was transnational, but also to test our ability as digital humanities scholars to robustly trace textual reappearance across multiple collections and data formats. The second aim of the project was to develop the means to track semantic drift across the same borders. Not only direct transcriptions and translations, but concepts and ideas as they traveled and evolved over time. This form of migration had not been tracked on a large scale before this project and presented several new technical and scholarly challenges to our team. In order to facilitate these two, I would say, content-driven aims, Oceanic Exchanges developed a third work package, ontologies. The aim of the ontologies projects was deceptively simple. Working with team members in all 6 countries, as well as sympathetic data providers, we were to gather representative samples of the data as stored in the backend and made available in the front end of these collections, and using relevant documentation from official sources, carefully map the metadata fields on a like-for-like basis across the 10 collections. We would then translate this into simple mappings for both human and machine-readable formats. The particular aim of this work was to support the data and periodical specialists on the team in leveraging content across collections. In the initial phases of the project, for example, reprinting matches were listed with all possible metadata fields across all collections, leading to huge spreadsheets with large empty spaces. This work would make like-for-like comparisons and, in particular, bibliographic identification across collections more straightforward. Because we already had access to the relevant collections, gathered and deposited under the management of my colleague Paul Fife from North Carolina State University, and we had colleagues who had previously worked with or had indeed had a hand in creating the data from all 10 collections, we allocated the ontologies projects with what we conceived to be a generous 1 month for the mapping process. The first challenge we faced in the ontologies project was the level of inconsistency across the collections, in both the broad and the specific. Having worked extensively with the data behind the British Library collections, particularly the JISC dataset, and having a general familiarity with the front end of most of the other collections, I had a very particular idea about the nature and structure of the material I would be working with. I was somewhat shocked to find that there was so much variation in the structure of the data and metadata, the availability of technical and research-friendly documentation, and even the accessibility of different types and formats of the text and image data. My colleague Emily will go into the finer details of the data and the metadata, but I will paint some broad strokes here. First, in terms of documentation, there was very little available. The British Library collections, namely those provided by Gale, contained some industry-standard document type definition information, DDTs. Europeana likewise had extensive documentation on its particular variant of the Metz-Alto protocol, and the Library of Congress contained the core Metz-Alto specifications. This gave us the basic starting point for tackling the data across all collections. Fortunately for our team, who used English as a lingua franca, this documentation was all in English, but much of the surrounding information was not, including official web pages about the collections, and we were forced to rely on certain team members to do unpaid translation work or to rely heavily upon Google Translate, which is not ideal for technical work. Moreover, the official documentation gave almost no information on selection criteria, input protocols, especially the sources of the metadata from catalogs, physical collection pages, and so on, or who had been actually involved in the data collection and cataloging. There was simply no human relevant provenance for the data. In the end, we spent months interviewing very patient librarians and digitization specialists, most of whom had not been involved in the initial projects and who were relying on folk knowledge from their institution or took significant internal research on our behalf, and the sprawling web of user-generated information, particularly from people like Bob Nicholson, Tim Sherritt, and Yvonne Perkins, who, to use Yvonne's term, had stumbled through the collections and left breadcrumbs for the rest of us. I want to clarify that this was not malevolence or neglect on part of the collection providers, who I said were incredibly generous in terms of retroactively creating histories and documentation for their collections. Instead, it was, as several noted, an artifact of a rapidly changing landscape, both in politics and funding, and an increasingly sound understanding of who and why exactly these collections were being used as they were, all of this taking place as the collections developed and were deployed. As a result, there was a very long web history of documentation, blog posts, forums, conference proceedings, from the people within and beyond the digitizing institutions, trying to make sense of the new and immensely powerful collections at their disposal. There were also large variations in the data itself. First, with the exception of the front-end database system for the Mexican collections, which were held in JSON for indexing reasons, the front and back end of other collections were all stored in various XML structures. These, however, were not the same. There was a general usage of Metz-Alto or Metz-Alto-like structures across the board, sometimes with Dublin core included. A separation of low-level newspaper title, mid-level issue, and high-level page or article data was generally common, but again, not consistent in how it was deployed. There was also in most cases information relating to the data or file structure, which would be useful to data scientists and those manipulating the computational content, and also information regarding the bibliographical or typographical structure, which would be more readily accessible to historians, literary scholars, and the like. However, the number of layers of resolution varied from collection to collection and between front and back ends within the same collections, and some of this variation was the result of the wider structures in which they were contained. For example, cross-compatibility with modern newspapers or contemporary publications in other media or formats. If we take just the text and image of the text as an example, some collections allowed direct access to the word-separated XML structure. Others to text blocks, which might represent typographical paragraphs or conceptual units like an article, running across typographical boundaries like pages. Others gave access to text matching the physical sheets or papers scanned. Some provided clean or tidied, that is XML-free OCR text, as you can see here, as a plain text file, separate from the XML entirely. In terms of images, there were archival quality JP2 or TIFF files, some of which were internet accessible, as well as web resolution JPEG and images that were cut up or embedded into HTML or other viewers. In most cases, I would say that the backend was more consistent than the front end, but as we had unprecedented access to the backend data across many collections, we had to take into account when describing these collections what would most scholars actually work with. The main takeaway from this discovery was that the significant amount of thought had gone into the organization of these datasets by librarians and publishers. However, at almost every stage, the tendency had been to collect and store the data in a way that would make indexing or computational storage of the material most efficient, and then make editorial choices that lowered the resolution of the data in order to make it more human accessible. The more data was tailored for the end consumer, the less information was accessible about its relation to the backend dataset, and the more metadata was lost. Finally, one of the most difficult inconsistencies we found, and this does relate back to documentation, was the lack of a firm connection between the physical, and I include microfilm here, and digital collections. There was, perhaps is, a general conception that these collections are complete representations of not only the existing, but the ever-in-existence collections of historical newspapers. Now, while that is probably not consciously recognized by most users, subconsciously, or at least in how they develop their methodologies, this is what is generally assumed. However, as we found out through extensive interviews with these and other collection and digitization providers, there is a huge level of variance in how these materials are digitized and selected. Speaking to different commercial publishers such as Redex, ProQuest, and Gale, as well as some libraries that had not yet or were in the process of digitizing, in addition to our main collection holders, we found that selection was almost always a compromise between completeness, whether by title, date, or region, or physical collection, and value, as determined by analytics, market research, or academic advisory boards and librarian experience. This is fine. I really want to stress this. This is fine. We did not expect, nor did we think it was possible or even ideal, maybe ideal, to have every newspaper that was ever in existence digitized. However, what was disconcerting was the lack of documentation on this process. When we published our recent article in Archival Science on why selection matters and the different rationales for selection in these collections, we had a particularly interesting response from readers. First, our results were kind of unsurprising. Everyone sort of knew subconsciously that there were gaps and choices being made. Whether they fully understood this consciously or in detail as we tried to document when working with these collections, I very much doubt. I almost never see historians or literary scholars acknowledge in particular detail the constraints of the data sets when discussing their results. It is vague, assumed. Archives are incomplete. My question, however, is how? What is the actual shape of your actual data set? Some providers were cagier about this than others, but in general, all had pretty good reasons for their selection choices. But they were either implicit and not documented, documented only internally, or left black boxed under the guise of an unnamed advisory panel and user focus groups. This had significant repercussions for not only how the collections were structured overall, but how the metadata was entered and provided. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Emily, who will discuss some of these variances in the actual data.
Okay, so most of the metadata is written in English, and that goes both for the content as well as the field types. However, it's not true for all collections, and within the 10 that we focused on for this report, we did focus on a lot of English language specific publications. English has become a standard language for XML, but the JSON file for the Mexican collection is in Spanish, both in terms of the fields and the content. And you can see that on this slide here. And this is the only collection that we looked at that uses JSON, by the way. Some other collections use English for the metadata fields, but the language of the content for things like the publication genre, so whether it's a newspaper or another kind of periodical. And that means that the multiple choice options are also in that language. So when working with international collections, you might be interested in what the language fields, which are present in all of these metadata files, refer to specifically. On the Oceanic Exchanges project, for example, several researchers were looking at immigrant Italian communities in America where the newspapers were both in English and Italian, and there was a shift over time towards more English language content. So having language fields for specific articles or even pages is helpful. You also need to know what the multiple choice options are when dealing with content in other languages. So this slide shows some of the language fields. Most collections have language information for the issue or for the publication as a whole. You can see Chronicling America has language for the text block, and that's what enables us to look at things like Italian immigrant communities and particular parts of the page in different languages. Europeana, Papers Past, and the Times Digital Archive have language of the article. Papers Past also has language of the section, and the Finnish collection and Mexican collections have language of the page. This is primary language, and there can also be language tags for multiple of these within one collection or even within one metadata file. What I'm going to focus on now is some of the kinds of differences you might spot in the collections, which if you're managing a collection like this or creating a new one, may be useful to think about in terms of what decisions you will make. So here you can see a short sample of metadata from the British Library and from the National Library of Mexico. Mexico uses a standardized date that also gives you the time and a date of registration in the database and tells you if it was a daily or a weekly publication. The ID also includes some date information. This version of the British Library metadata, and there are several different versions in their collections, is formatted differently and specifies that it is the printed date, which itself can be ambiguous, as it could be inferred to mean the date on which the newspaper was printed, which is not always the same day that it was published, or as the date as printed on the newspaper. It's also true that most collections only archive and digitize one edition per day of the newspapers, and newspapers did change things in different editions during the day, so the time, while it might not seem relevant or even possible to specify a particular time of day within that standardized date for your newspaper, it might be useful in indicating something like periodicity if you say morning or afternoon. But if you're looking for morning or afternoon editions, some databases either don't have them at all or don't have a way to search them specifically. If you're creating other kinds of collections, consider what the most useful date format will be for your collection. There should be some form of standardized date, but having a specific time is rarely going to be useful for 19th century documents. And as you can see from this short example, it becomes increasingly clear, hopefully, why the fields can't be mapped directly, which brings me to this horrible diagram which we made using draw.io, trying to map the metadata directly into 4 broad categories, which were metadata containing content, metadata about the physical object, metadata about the digital object, and metadata pertaining to both of these. The aim was to eventually create an OWL ontology, which would itself tell you all the fields containing a specific kind of metadata. If you're looking at this and you can't see it and it doesn't make sense to you, don't worry, that's basically the point of what I'm showing you here. You can find a version on our website, digitisednewspapers.net, where you can zoom in and have a bit of a closer look. So we tried to map all of the fields from the various collections, which is over 3,300 different lines in a spreadsheet, directly. And our TSV file includes our own categories and subcategories, field names, collection IDs, XPaths, format, multiple choice options, example content, definitions drawn from the documentation, and content types. We faced several problems with this. Firstly, as indicated, even fields which look like they might map together at the broadest possible resolution, like the date, really contain slightly different content, printed date, standardized date, and so on. Secondly, having a team of around 10 different people inputting each collection separately introduced inconsistencies which replicated metadata input problems. Essentially, all the little decisions we as individuals made about defining categories or creating hierarchies introduced the same kinds of issues as many hands involved in inputting metadata create. With the millions of pages of digitized newspapers constantly being produced, this is inevitable for the metadata. For our team, it meant we needed a stronger editorial oversight to work through all the collections and ensure consistency, but it was very revealing to us about the kinds of problems digitizers face. One way to try to handle this issue, if you're someone who's responsible for creating this kind of metadata, is to have clear documentation packaged with the data, or something like forums or other avenues for people to share their own issues and workarounds. So what we've got on the slide now is an example of part of a DTD, a document type definition file. We were only given these for the British Library. No other collections seem to have them, and I can't stress enough how useful they are. What it does is provide a guide for exactly what goes into each field. And this is useful both for people inputting and for people looking at the metadata that you have. They also need to be updated regularly. There are still fields in the British Library collections without a definition, and they should be readily available to users as well. There are some other kinds of documentation that I'm going to talk about now that are also worth considering if this is something that you're preparing. Europeana is a particularly great model for this. As it's a collection that aggregates from other collections, it's based on existing metadata and did the same kind of thing we did in trying to create an OWL ontology, but they did actually make it possible to work across a lot of collections within their platform. I highly recommend looking at what they have made available if you're considering metadata for a new or existing collection. And here on the slide, you can see some examples of their report, which is their guide to the metadata fields, which also summarises some of the issues across newspaper collections. Other models include having forums, which is something Trove used to do, and allowing user-generated metadata, such as comments and lists, which again, only Trove, within the ones we looked at, did. While there's obviously a risk in allowing untrained hands to contribute, it does improve article transcription quality because they were able to look at the OCR text and make corrections. And it facilitates finding of items in a new way because they can be tagged within sub-collections or with other keywords. So that's something to consider. It has been, the Trove one has been taken offline here, so you can see from this Google search result some of the kinds of things that were on the forum. So we used all of these different kinds of documentation in making our data file. And in our next video, we'll talk a bit more about the atlas, but I'd like to draw attention to the information that we have aggregated in this data set. We've given each item its own identifier so that we can indicate the relationships between different lines in the spreadsheet. We've then categorized them, and these relate to our atlas entry categories with subcategories where needed. The collections are indicated, the XPath for the field is given, and the name of the field is given. We also give the format, the content type, whether it's multiple choice, a string, a container, a number, what kind of data it contains, and so on, and example content. Where we can find them, we give them multiple choice options. We haven't always been able to find them though, so that's another call for document type definitions. Then we give a definition, either based on DTDs or metadata standards that are centralized, often through the Library of Congress, or any other documentation like the Europeana guides or the forums. We give element type, which is just elements and attributes, or directory structures and JSON elements, and we've mapped the relationships between them. So we've focused and put into the report primarily the ones that contain content rather than lots and lots of layers of empty containers, but those are in the spreadsheet, the TSV file, if you want to have a look. So we've focused on these fields with content data, but we don't have definitions for everything even within those. So again, I'd like to stress just how important it is, and that one of the things we'd like to cover in the workshop is what kind of information it would be helpful to put together with the metadata. The document type definitions could include a bit more information, a bit more historical detail to explain how the field should be filled in. So my final prompt question ahead of the workshop is what data is missing that would be useful from these metadata fields in these collections? In previous discussions we've had, people have suggested being able to look specifically at newspaper mastheads would be useful, for example, and these are not currently zoned in a way that you can look at specifically when you're searching a collection. Another example, a collection that we didn't look at for this project is the Impresso project, which includes newspapers' political affiliations where available. And you can see here some of the metadata that they include. So this question is something we'd like you to discuss in the workshop, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts.